Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us on this live talk with the amazing Martin Lindstrom. I'm here at Cărturești Verona bookstore, a place that has hosted so many book launches and literary events over the years. And I think you might be as nostalgic as I am about the pre-pandemic meetings in this area with our favorite authors. Remember maybe the excitement of asking questions or standing in line for an autograph. It's been too long, but I really hope we will be back to this. Still, there are some advantages that came from the current situation, like this very meeting with Martin Lindstrom, joining us from thousands of miles away. Of course, he needs no introduction. I'm just going to say that he's one of the world's leading experts in business, branding, and cultural transformation, and a New York Times best-selling author. We'll talk today about this new release, The Ministry of Common Sense, but you can still find some of his other books on the shelves of Cărturești, like Small Data, Biology, Brand Sense, are all available right here in the bookstore or online on cărturești.ro. Hello, Martin. Welcome. It's very nice to see you again.
Thank you. It's great to see you again. I feel we are bumping into each other almost every second week these days, right?
You are not going to get rid of me. As you've seen, we've seen each other 2 weeks ago, now again talking about your book. Meanwhile, I managed to finish it because, you know, when we've met last time, I had some chapters left. So it's been
How was it? Did you like it?
I told you as last time, I really enjoyed it. I laughed a lot. Also, I cried a little bit because, you know, I work in a big corporation. And sometimes for us, it's really hurting to see the truth, naked truth in front of our eyes. But it's in the same time awakening. And thank you very much for this wake-up call. I think we all need to read this book because going back to common sense nowadays, I think it's really, really crucial. How are you? Where are you right now?
I am in Switzerland at the moment, enjoying life. There's still some snow left, and there's a lot of cows here and a lot of chocolate here. So I'm at home, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because just about a year ago, I would be traveling 300 days a year across more than typically 40 countries a year. So my lifestyle has been thrown up and down, which has been absolutely amazing for me.
Well, like everyone else, but you had us at the chocolate in Switzerland. So please, let's not open that subject about chocolate. Thank you very much, Martin. So I'm very happy to have this conversation with you for all the Cărturești customers and readers. And, you know, it's one of the biggest bookstores in Romania, and they are going to launch your book right now. And also they have several of your books here on the shelves. So you are quite famous here in Romania, as you can see. So please tell me, how did you come up with the idea of this book?
Well, I really came up with the idea of this book because I was getting sick and tired of the lack of common sense. And really, it happens everywhere. And I think the best way for me to illustrate that is what happened during this pandemic. Take a look at this.
Hello?
Hello.
Excuse me. What time are we starting?
Is this thing on?
I can't hear you.
Did anyone get an agenda, or is it just me?
I hope you don't mind that Helen's here. She gets really weird when I close the door on her. Just like that.
Oh, dude, no. Oh, somebody tell him.
Oh, I thought I turned the camera off.
I can't hear you. You're muted.
That's what I was thinking.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so
You go.
you go first.
Okay, so I was thinking.
So yes, oh, sorry, no.
No, please.
Okay, I'm ready for my PowerPoint presentation. Oh, I've cut it down. It's only 186 slides.
TikTok.
What?
TikTok.
I have to go pee so bad it hurts.
It'll only take 90 minutes.
Where the heck are Sandy, Bob 1 and 2? How come they're always the last to join?
I can't wait anymore. I'll be right back.
Well, that was 2 hours of my life I'll never get back. Next meeting, let's make it 2 days from now, same time. And let's get some decisions made.
Hey guys, how's it going? Oh, wait. What company is this?
I hope someone's recording this.
It's absolutely crazy. This is the life we live in. Think about it. We're sitting behind our screens perhaps 6 hours or 8 hours every day. Toilet breaks are gone. It's back to back. And then finally, when we're over the work, we throw ourselves at the couch, exhausted, right? And then it's time to do our work. I mean, this is the issue. I've noticed that the idea of common sense is completely vanished when we talk about COVID-19. And it really is not a new phenomenon. In fact, what I would claim happening is that common sense has been lost for many, many years. I mean, here's an example. So just a couple of years ago, I went into a hotel in Miami. I wanted to watch television in my room, and I grabbed the remote control. Here's a copy of the remote control. And this remote control looks like it can launch a spaceship. It has 3 numerical keyboards. It has A, B, C, D, whatever that means. It has 6 arrows going up and down. And listen to this. It has 2 on buttons. Not sure how that works. Anyway, I managed to switch on the television. And guess what? Then after 5 minutes where I wanted to switch it off again, I grabbed the remote control and I realized there's 2 off buttons on the remote control. Now, when I pressed the first off button, the television did not change at all, but instead the light in the room dimmed in kind of a moody, sexy way. And when I checked this, I clicked the second off button. Guess what? The air conditioning system went off, but of course the television was still on, right? So I had to crawl under the bench and unplug the mini bar along with the television and the nearby lamp. And this is really my story. But here comes a twist to the story, which is absolutely crazy. What happened was that I went on a plane 3 months later, and I sat next to this engineer, and I asked him, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Well, I work for a company which you probably don't know." I said, "Who?" And he pointed to this name on this very remote control. I said, "You must be kidding." And I pulled out my computer and I showed him a PowerPoint slide I had of this remote control. And I said, "What the heck went wrong with you guys?" Now, this guy, he looked at me like a deer in the headlights, not understanding a word. So I explained for him how I couldn't use the television and said, "Hey, there's a reason why." And he explained that they had problems with the real estate, as they call it, that space here on the remote. He said that, TiVo people were fighting against Netflix people who were fighting against the television, recording people. And in fact, they had a lot of problems with the inventory on this remote control. So they came up with a brilliant idea. They said, why don't we split everything into different zones? So you will notice that one zone is responsible for TiVo, another one for Netflix, the third one for recording, and fourth one for television, whatever it was. And he said, it's brilliant because there's no issues anymore. We all know exactly what is good and what is bad. And I said to him, except one thing, I don't know how to switch on the television anymore. Now, here's my question. Could you do this in a more simple way? Is that possible? Just asking, right? Because here's the issue. We are slowly losing sight of reality. Because here's the issue with this remote control. They were seeing the world from inside out, not from outside in. And the issue really is this, that it's almost like a bridge. If you take a metaphor, if there's a little crack in the bridge, it's an indication of a bigger damage inside the structure of the bridge. Well, that's a little bit the same with my remote control, that the fact is that when you can't use it, you actually are looking at a much bigger problem inside the organization. The issue I have learned over the years is that in general, we actually become blind. I think a good example of that would be when I, so many years ago, when involved in redesigning exit signs in buildings. Now, as you all remember, exit signs are at the ceiling, but I have one little question for you. What direction does smoke go towards? Does it go up or does it go down? You're right, smoke goes up. So how come the exit sign is up? Why don't you place it down at the bottom instead, down at the floor? And that's exactly the issue which I time after time realize that sometimes we simply do not see the world from the right point of view. So one of the things I tend to say is we need to bring common sense into this. And now, I don't need to tell you, COVID-19 has made this issue even worse. I mean, I'll tell you a story which is crazy. So just recently I was out flying and I took a seat on the plane and there was this announcement on the plane. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will have a wonderful flight with our airline. I need to inform you that all cabin service has been completely suspended on the entire flight. It also means that you're not allowed to use the lavatories in the front of the cabin. In fact, only the cabin crew are allowed to use those. So here we were, 131 passengers, was now had to walk down the aisle, pass by every single passenger, while we ended up in the line as long as the airport security control thing. And guess what? There we were all standing, breathing in this freshly brewed smell of toilet mixed up with a faint aroma of COVID-19. And not only that, just to make it even worse, you know, in the old days, you had entertainment systems on board on planes, right? Well, there's a brand new version of entertainment systems which have been introduced. It's called the contact tracing form. It's a very simple form which are tracing you wherever you are. And guess what the first question is? The first question is, have you been in close proximity with anyone you don't know over the last 12 hours? Well, guess what I only had to do? I could just look at the lady sitting next to me and get her name and her phone number, and of course put it down in the form. And by the way, the second question is even more ridiculous. As you know, we don't have a pen anymore. You know, we use smartphones or whatever. So this brilliant passenger on the first row borrows a pen from the purser. And this pen, after it's been used, is walking its way through the aisles down to me, passenger number 111. And of course, the second question is, have you touched in something which anyone else have touched over the last 12 hours? And the only thing I had to do was, I guess, to write yes again. I mean, here's the issue. Why has a simple action like buying office equipment turned into a 6-people committee decision followed by a 5-level approval process? As I say, when a 264-page PowerPoint deck kicks off with "Welcome to the Spring Party Planning Meeting," I personally believe it's time to call the Minister of Common Sense and put an end to all this once and for all. So, of course, your question to me right now would be, why is this at all happening? Well, this is where it becomes really fascinating, because one of the things I discovered as I began writing the book was really this, that there is a direct correlation between common sense and empathy. And this, for me, is really interesting, because what I've learned, that common sense is all about seeing the world from a common point of view, from someone else. But what's interesting about empathy is that empathy is all about putting yourself in the shoes of another person and feel what that other person is feeling. And this is really interesting, because what it means is that the more empathy you have in an organization, the more common sense you have. Or opposite, if you have no empathy at all, you have no common sense. Remember, what is the opposite of common sense? Well, that is nonsense. So why is this important for me to explore? It's important because we have to learn that empathy will be the key driver of how we drive and build businesses in the future. In fact, mark my words, you will hear so much stuff going on around the word empathy over the next 5 years that you can't believe it, because this is going to be front and center of everything. So before I do more, before I tell you more, actually, let me just introduce you a little bit deeper to the concept of empathy. And I'll do that through the voice of Teresa Wiseman. Take a look at this.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Oh, that's really sweet, isn't it? But here's the issue. We actually increasingly need to be better at changing our perspective and seeing the world from a different point of view. And we really are not very good at it right now, because here's what's happening. When you go back to studies, you will notice that there's an area in the brain called the right supramarginal gyrus, which is part of the cerebral cortex, which is the front part of our brain. And studies now show that that is where empathy is living. But here comes the scary part. According to University of Michigan, who conducted a study among 14,000 students over 30 years, they actually realized that the degree of empathy among college students have dropped some crazy 48% over the last decade alone. In fact, the ability to share perspective with others has dropped another 34%, which may actually explain the reason why we saw the 6th of January crisis in Washington, D.C. in the United States, because that slowly is basically destroying the very concept of democracy. Remember, democracy is the ability to agree with other people. Why am I saying this? I'm saying it for 2 reasons. The first thing is, when you think about history, you would probably agree with me that through history, what we've noticed is that we actually have become and have been the superior race for a long time. But what has happened is that we actually became the superior race because we had the right supramarginal gyrus in activation, i.e. the ability to have empathy. We could kind of put ourselves in the footstep of a bear trying to attack us, sort of, and predict what the bear would be doing. But as this is now slowly disappearing, we actually slowly are losing what actually made us become what we are today. This is our undoing. In fact, what I would claim is that we right now are experiencing an existential crisis for the very concept of empathy. And remember, with empathy, you have a direct correlation with the idea of common sense. And this, of course, is not just happening in our lives. It's also happening elsewhere. I mean, it's happening in retail environments. This is actually a very large hardware store in the United States who actually set up these CCTV cameras and filmed the consumers. They couldn't understand why sales had decreased quite a lot over the years. So all the research studies were showing that everything was normal. But when they started to look at this, what I call small data, small observations you're picking up every day, they realized that something was completely wrong. And in fact, this study was only conducted among 3 random people, but it was shown to the board of the company. And as a consequence of that, the company changed the entire configuration of the store because it was designed around saving money and cost efficiency and all that stuff. And of course, it actually became much better and sales went up. I mean, even companies which are really good at customer service like Amazon have their moments where they don't really get what this is all about. And I think this is my point. My point is that we need to understand that common sense is disappearing across almost every aspect. So if I should go back to the very framework of common sense, I want to share with you 3 different perspectives, which I find are very intriguing. First of all, let me share a little model with you. Now, if you imagine you have should on the top and you have shouldn't on in the bottom, you have do on the left and you have don't on the right. Now, first of all, I would claim that if you actually were to map down all the stupid stuff going on every day in our life that will be living down there, I call that eliminate. And one of the pieces of advice I would like you to think about is, as we all are going back to work, in fact, I would not even call it going back to work. I would call it going forward to work. Why don't you reevaluate the way you work? I mean, all these stupid routines you have every day, why don't we change it? I mean, I actually started to map down how I was working every day, and I realized that I spent 1 hour and 20 minutes every day watching stupid YouTube videos. Can you imagine? And I can't even remember what they were about. So we will have a lot of stuff going on every day, which I call eliminate. Start to ask yourself, what is that? Also ask yourself, what are the stuff you're doing where you're not really sure if this is appropriate or not? It's just like, does it make sense or not? Don't know. Now, here's what's so interesting. What's interesting is that everything down there in the red is what I call nonsense. That is stuff which actually is a waste of time. And what we estimate today is that, in fact, some 45% of everything we do every day, in fact, is taking place down there. So here's my advice. Remember, there's no going back to work. It's called going forward to work. You should create your own, not to-do list, but an un-to-do list where you remove all the stupidities you do, because this is the moment for us to do it, given the fact that we changed our entire way of working and living. And then, of course, you go up to the next level, which is what I call retain. And last but not least, you will have improve. That's all the stuff, which actually is pretty good. You just want to make it even stronger. Now, why do I tell you about that? Because this is where the lack of common sense is growing. Because if I do stupid stuff, other people are doing stupid stuff, suddenly we start to think about the world from inside out. But what I'm tending to say is that you have to see the world from outside in. And really, if I go back to the very same model one more time, you actually can see it from either inside out or outside in. So you could ask yourself at work, what processes in your organization are truly frustrating? My God, there's a lot, right? So this is the first question you can ask. But if you want to ask the same question seen from a customer's point of view, so from outside in, you can say, which of your products, services, or interactions would your customer like to improve or to kill? Now, this is so important for you because one of the things I'm going through in my book is I'm talking a lot about empathy and about common sense, but I'm also helping you to clean up your life and cleaning up all the stupidities going on in our companies. And here's the issue. Why is there so much stuff going on, which is bad? Well, this is my second question, because the second question is, what are the assumptions justifying the current approach? And oh my God, we have a lot of excuses, right? You know what I mean? One excuse after another. We did that 10 years ago and we don't want to do it again. It didn't work, or we can't afford it, or legal won't agree with it, or by the way, compliance is in dispute of what we're doing. All these excuses will be popping in here. Now, this is the excuse parking lot, right? Now, here comes the clever thing. As we move up to shoot and up to do, that whole new space up there, here's what I've learned. Many years ago, I wrote a book called Biology, B-U-Y-ology. It's a book about how we buy and the psychology using neuroscience to understand our subconscious behavior. And one of the things I learned from that book was, and our global study, was that 85% of everything we do every day is subconscious. It's something taking place at the subconscious part of our brain. Now, this is really fascinating because this is where the excuses are happening. Here is the question to you. The question is this. If we scrapped this approach, all these excuses you have down there underneath it, and stop pretending that people actually are irrational, and actually were saying, what is this irrational person all about? Then how would the world look like? And then the last thing we should do is to introduce what we call a 90-day intervention, a small effort you're doing, which immediately can address that issue. Now, before I tell you, I want to give you a case in a second, but before I do that, let me just share a perspective which is really fascinating here. Small companies have one thing in common, and I didn't think about that before I started to write the book. Small companies have one thing in common, and that is that they're all about empathy. Big companies have one thing in common: empathy is disappearing. So really, when you look at the graph one more time, you'll see the big companies are growing down there, down in the nonsense space, whereas entrepreneurial companies, small startup businesses, they have a high degree of common sense. And this is the reason why you will notice that smaller startups are more nimble, they're faster at changing things. Things are just going more smooth. Why? Because they see the world through the eyes of the consumer. So why is that? Why don't the big companies do that? Well, I think a good example of that is with two guys which were smoking weeds in a dorm room in a university in the United States. Off their head, they were shooting photos of each other, uploading it on social media. And guess what? Hell broke loose. And of course, the parents freaked out. And the day after, the friend was saying to his mate, I wish we could retract those photos. Well, guess what? That was the birth of Snapchat. And I'm telling you this story because Snapchat today is a $50 billion company. They were born and raised feeling empathy. They felt the pain of the customer. They felt the pain of the consumer. They recruited like-minded people. They created a movement. And suddenly this company grew because people were truly believers of this. But as companies grow bigger, suddenly legal comes in, compliance come in. The founders are leaving. Think about Google, right? And suddenly you have this immune system, a defense mechanism of change, which suddenly is taking over the company and killing it. And I'm telling you this because it's important to understand that when you work with companies, you should never, ever lose the sense of empathy. I think a good example of that would be my work for one of the largest pharma companies around the world. Now, this company is a leader in respiratory disease. And in fact, they asked me to come in and help them to get closer to the patients. So the first thing I asked them, of course, was, when did you last time spend time with the consumer, the patient? And they said, never. Never? Yeah, never. So I said, what? So they said, why? Well, compliance don't want to allow us doing it. Fine, I said. So we persuaded compliance to change their mind. And then we went into homes of patients. And I landed in the home of a 28-year-old girl. And she actually had asthma her entire life. So I asked her a profound question. How did it feel to have asthma when you were a child? And she started to cry. And she told me this very touching story about how she was teased in school, how she had no friends, how she was disinvited from parties. It really was horrible. So I said to her, listen, when I look at you today, it looks like you have a lot of confidence. What has changed? And she said to me, I'll tell you what it is. And she grabbed her handbag, right? She pulled it out and she pulled a straw out of her handbag. She said, this is my secret. I said, what is that? Well, I always ask my friends to take the straw, hold themselves through the nose, and breathe through the nose, or breathe through the straw while holding themselves through the nose. And suddenly they will get how it feels to be an asthma patient. And that is a kind of exchanging a sense of empathy. So I took that idea, by the way, and I basically asked the board of this company to do exactly the same. We switched off the light. Everyone had a straw where the sound of a person with heavy breathing, very disturbing breathing. And then people had to breathe through this straw. And after 30 seconds, one guy spits out the straw. He said, this is ridiculous. You can't do it. And I said to him, well, that's exactly how you patients feel every minute of the entire life. And if you could hear a penny drop on the floor, you would have heard it. I mean, it really introduced the very concept of empathy into the organization. Suddenly, they started to see the patients in a different light. They started to do research and development in a different light. They had new onboarding empathy kits as well. And all of this comes down to what I talked about before, because once you have empathy coming into the organization, it's directly correlated with common sense. And then suddenly common sense become part of this. So how do you solve this? Well, let me just get back to my little map. And let's just talk about an airline company for a moment. So one of our clients is Swiss International Airlines. And Swiss International Airlines, in fact, for many years has been well known for the passenger service. But there was one thing which was really interesting about these guys. And that was that they, like anyone else, have their issues. You see, here's the issue. When you're complaining on board on the plane, they're not taking it serious. I mean, they do, but it takes 6 weeks or 8 weeks before the form you filled out, the complaint, is going through ground handling and being addressed, and they'll come back to you. And of course, in the meantime, you freak out, right? You hammer away on the social media and destroying the company through all your anger, right? So here's what we decided to do. We wanted to look at this airline company in a different way. So going back to the model we talked about before, first of all, remember the first question is, what would your customer fundamentally like to change or improve if they could? Well, here we basically said, recognize the issue and give me the compensation now, right? No, you don't want to wait for 8 weeks. That's ridiculous, right? So what was holding the organization back from changing? Well, that's the second part here. Well, honestly, we don't trust our cabin crew. That probably was the reason why. So they used that as an excuse for not changing, something which became more and more frustrating for passengers and actually damaging the brand in the end of the day. So going back to the model, the third question, remember, was if we scrap this approach and stop pretending people were rational, what would we change? I think you know exactly what the answer is going to be now. Let me just get back to this model one more time. The answer is this. The administration cost per passenger is $89. Can you imagine? It's crazy, right? $89 is the price it costs for them just to do the administration of those complaints on ground. So we said to them, very simple, let's donate that fee, that administration fee to the passengers. And in fact, why don't we go further? Why don't we give the cabin crew a kit of options where they can give all their passengers all these different compensation things if there's a serious complaint going on. And we did it. And here's what's so interesting. We then rolled out a 90-day intervention, which really is, let's run a 1-month pilot on one sector measuring the passenger compensation and satisfaction. And what we learned was this, and this is really so intriguing. We learned that, in fact, when we did it, passengers became more happy, and in fact, the airline was saving more money. I mean, this is so profound that, in fact, you actually can get rid of nonsense and reinstall common sense and actually earn money at the same time while you're also making both passengers or customers, and in this case, employees and staff more happy, because suddenly the cabin crew literally felt they got a mandate back. They were listened to. People started to trust them. All that stuff is super important. So this is really my comment. In the end of the day, what I would say is that we need to be seriously good at understanding the world. And if you look at your own life, what you have to ask yourself is, of course, what would you like to change if you actually were in charge with your own life? If you could improve things, if you could retain, park, and eliminate, I would work on this model, and I would ask myself, what are the things which really should change? I would also do the same from a customer point of view. I would literally say, hey, what actually should I improve here? So again, ask yourself the question seen from a customer's point of view. Again, what would customers love to eliminate because it's so frustrating? What would they say, not sure that's worth it? What do they really love? What's making your brand become so strong? And of course, what could be improved? And if you map this down, what you will notice happening is that suddenly these customers start to see you through another lens. So really, this is a very, very quick introduction to the very concept of common sense. And I guess there's no better way than to quote Benjamin Franklin, which once said, common sense is something that everyone needs, few have, and none think they lack. Here we go. It's time to bring back common sense. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you very much, Martin. You gave us a lot of examples, and I'm pretty sure you have more. That's why I'm going to start my questions right now. Meanwhile, I would like to tell all our viewers that they can ask their own questions if they want to on the Cărturești live page right now. And actually, for the first two questions, we are going to give 2 books for free as a reward for the ones that are the most courageous one. But meanwhile, I have prepared something, Martin, just to prove to you that I was reading your book. I want to ask you something. So there is one thing here that struck me, and I think it made me a little bit sad, but another thing that intrigued me, and I would like you to explain me what you had in mind. So you said something like this: when people start working inside organizations, something happens to them. They forget they are human. They start adhering to rules, processes, procedures, and official and unofficial codes of behavior that makes no sense to anyone outside that organization. And I can tell you that is true. But then you also said at the end of your book that we should go back to the age-to-age theory. Age-to-age stands for human to human, and you said to us to banish the terms such as B2B or B2C and replace them to age-to-age. So how can we, the robots from corporations, go back to being humans? Let me put it this way. What can you tell us, or what can you teach us to do in order to go back to our human side and not being all the time into all these rules and processes and procedures that transformed us completely?
Well, I'm going to answer your question in 2 different ways. First of all, let me just address the idea of that B2B actually does not exist anymore. In fact, I would claim that B2B is the same as B2C, and that's why I introduced this new term, which I call H to Health, H to H, human to human. And because what we've noticed is that there is no such thing as B2B or B2C anymore. The best way for me to illustrate that is to take you back a couple of years ago when I was in Zambia spending time with Malcolm Gladwell, which is another fellow author. He wrote a book called Tipping Point, or David or Goliath, or Outliers. And we're sitting there in the savannah, and Malcolm asked me a question. He said to me, Martin, have you noticed how people are no longer wearing hats in the Western world? Yet they still do it here in the savannah. And it was Malcolm Gladwell asking a tricky question. So I thought a little bit about it, about a year. And then I realized that, in fact, this whole story began in 1961. That was the year where J.F. Kennedy was the first president in the history of the United States to actually be inaugurated without wearing a hat. He had no hat on. And then you can say, well, what does it have to do with anything? Well, a lot. And because that was the first time where we were merging private and work. I presume back then that you would take a hat on when you'd go to work and take it off when you went back home again. Well, that was kind of disappearing. Later on, Steve Jobs was the first not to wear a tie. And then later on, we all installed an office in our own pocket called the smartphone. And today we all have a pipeline of bureaucracy going straight into our bedrooms. So what I'm saying is that there is no such thing as B2B and B2C because it's one big thing. So that means that when you would talk about consumers and branding and all that stuff, we actually cannot anymore talk about there is a corporate person, whatever that is. It doesn't exist. That person is just as impacted about emotions as if that person was private. No, how can we then introduce common sense and make things become more human in organizations? Well, to my knowledge, the best thing you can do is actually to do a little experiment internally. So I would recommend you to find out what is the frustration or the friction which you really are disturbed about at work. Then I would team up with one of your colleagues and ask them if they have the same view. In fact, here's a trick. Take photos of all the frustrations you have just to memorize it, hang them on the wall if you're allowed to go into a physical space, or put them on a virtual wall if you're working from home. And then ask your colleagues to point out what they agree with. Here's what you're going to realize. There's one really crazy frustration you always see, and it's so frustrating. That's the one you should point out. And then you should say to your colleagues, let's just fix it. Let's give each other 90 days. We'll just fix it without asking for permission. And then you fix it. And once you do that, something interesting is happening. You actually will suddenly have a victory. You will realize, my gosh, I can change things finally. And then you do another one and another one and another one. And suddenly you do the transformation. So here's my advice. You need to infuse a sense of hope into the organization. You need to make sure that people see evidence that change actually is possible. And once that happens, it's almost like that stretch jacket you wear when you can't get out of it. You get rid of it, you throw it away, and suddenly the immune system is breaking down and you can start to breathe. And that's where you become human again.
Thank you very much, Martin. That's a very good exercise. And actually, I'm gonna do it in my company and let you know what's to come out. But I wanna take something that you said about technology, and you also asked us to do this exercise. What are the things that we should, stop doing it, or what should we keep? Do you think there is a relationship between all the apps, technology that surrounds us at work, and the loss of empathy and common sense? Do you
Absolutely.
think what technology brought us here in this point?
I do think that it's very, very hard for people to be human when you sit in front of a screen all the time. I don't need to tell you. I mean, 4 years ago, I did an experiment. I decided to get rid of my phone, and I haven't had a phone ever since. And I realized 3 things were happening. The first thing was happening was that suddenly I kind of started to see people again. Now, in the old days, I would be standing in a bar waiting for someone. The person was late. So what would I do? I would grab my phone and do something with my phone. Anything on my phone, not to look like a loser. Well, that's the first thing. The second thing is I would not see details because everything I would see would be through the lens of my phone. But the third thing was very disturbing. I never got bored anymore. And boredom is the foundation for creativity. It's that pause you have in life. It's that moment where you have time to reflect and connect dots in a new way. But guess what? That started to disappear. And once I got rid of the phone, I actually started to regain my creativity. A lot of authors I work with across the world actually says exactly the same. Now, if I go back to the work environment where we all are, suffering from a lot of fatigue, Zoom fatigue, you will notice that we actually are almost reactive to all this stuff we are bombarded with every day. It's like we can't keep up the breath. We have zero pauses in between things. There's no time to prepare. In fact, I'm preparing what I'm doing for the next meeting now. So I'm not even present anymore. And so technology has made us become a slave. So my advice to you is, you are suffering from that, is three things. First of all, think about these calls as a door. You're opening the door, right? And you're going into this world of this call you have right now. Once you've done the call, you actually do your notes straight after. Don't leave the room. You do your notes straight after. You spend 5 or 10 minutes on it. And then you mentally close the door. And then you open the door to another thing. You need to have a reset period in between. And by the way, when you go to work in the morning, if you are working from home, go out of your main door, walk around the building you're living in, and go back into your office or wherever you do your work. Because that resets your brain. It's called a transition period. And we know from neuroscience, it actually makes you more productive and actually smarter at work. What I would also recommend you to do is to ensure that you have more breaks in general. In fact, if I was you, I would create artificial break times, 1 or 2 or 3 hours, where you allow yourself to be creative and think and reflect. Because if you don't do that, you just become a robot. You become a slave of all this stuff. And suddenly you're not thinking anymore. You are basically losing common sense and replacing it with nonsense.
Well, Martin, thank you very much. I think these are very useful tips that we all should apply, because we all became robots during this pandemic while working from home, and this works very well. We started to have very interesting questions on our Facebook page, and I will take the first 2 that are also winning the books from Adi Stoianescu. Hello, Martin, he says. My question is this to you. Do you think we'll come out of this pandemic with more common sense or with less?
Well, it's very funny you're saying it, because I was just on a live interview with Financial Times half an hour ago, and I was asked exactly the same question. So well done. Now, here's my answer to you. Some things will not be that common sense driven, because here's the risk. The risk is that you're applying your bad routine from before COVID-19. Now you add another layer of complexity on top of it, because we're sitting in front of our screens and all these back-to-back meetings and no toilet breaks. And then if you don't leave this environment when COVID-19 is disappearing, you'll end up with no life. So my recommendation to you is, use that map I mentioned for you. Evaluate how much you should evaluate or eliminate and park. Go through and develop your on-to-do list as soon as COVID-19 is gone, or at least fading out. But also do it at a company level. Because if you don't do that, here's the risk. Then you will replicate all the bad mistakes we did in the past, and it's going to be even more of a nightmare. And this is important for me to say, because we will see company cultures will struggle in a big way in the future, because people are so tired of working behind a screen. They have no motivation, they have no purpose in life. So it's just so important for you that you reinfuse that by resetting people's life. So long story short, common sense will in some instances actually become stronger, because we've made better efficiencies. We're doing things in a more smart way. We're not flying around the world and destroying the environment. But there'll be other things will be much worse, where you're using the excuse of COVID-19 to do things. And just to illustrate my point here, think about when there was a British guy, a terrorist, who supposedly had a bomb in his shoe some 16 years ago, whenever it was. Well, because of that, the rest of the world had to take their shoes off when they're going through security in the airport. The rest of our lives, one person did it. And today, technology can remove that whole idea, but we're still doing it. That's an example about how a bad habit just stays with us, and that's a risk with COVID-19 as well.
Well, thank you. And we have then the second question from Mihai Preda. How do we have common sense with insincere people in formal situations where we must accept their perspective? Most probably, maybe Mihai is referring to his boss or something like that. So let's help him out in this respect.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Bill Bernbach, which were a major advertising guru back in the 70s, actually always had a little note, a little piece of paper in his pocket. And there was 4 words on it. And whenever he had a conflict with someone where he truly disagreed or they had a fight or discussion, he would pull out this paper and he'd read it for himself. And it said, what if he was right? What if he was right? And I do think we increasingly have no patience and we have no energy to see the world from another person's point of view. So that would be my first advice to you. What if he's right? Try to put yourself in the shoes of him or her and see the world through that person's point of view. Now, let's assume that you're now concluding he was right, she is wrong, whatever it is. Then what I would recommend you to do is to do the exercise with a straw. The best thing you can do is to bring a customer inside your organization. It is to ask that person to share with all of you how he or she sees the world. Because he is the issue. The issue today is that we increasingly, when we become a big company, are drinking out of the Kool-Aid. We become blind. And these business leaders increasingly are becoming blind as well. They've forgotten about that there is a real world out there, right? So if you bring in a customer and you have a conversation with the customer, suddenly we will not see the world from inside out through politics and what's not possible. We'll start to say, what? I never thought about that. That's pretty interesting stuff. And suddenly you will change the perspective. So using the power of empathy is a very smart way of turning the table. And you can do that by visiting consumers or bring them into your organization. But anything which really is placing the customer in your organization is a trick. And just so you know, a lot of companies actually have an empty chair in the meeting rooms with the right customers on it. And they put that in every meeting room. And whenever people have discussions, they look at the empty chair and they say, what would the customer do? And suddenly you will see that that crazy leader of yours, which don't get a thing, will have to admit that the customer probably have a different point of view. And that will help you to change him and change the organization for the better.
Thank you, Martin. We still, the questions keep coming. And even though I had prepared some of my own, I prefer to take some of the questions that are coming on the Facebook page because there are very interesting questions. So I will go to the question of Stefana because it's building on the same question that I had. It's about the corporate versus the startup environment. Did you notice significant differences in the way that they react when it comes to practicing the age-to-age approach? The differences between entrepreneurs and the people working in the corporation. And actually you mentioned this in your presentation, that there is a difference between this. So can you maybe build a little bit more on this?
I think it's very important, Stefana, that to understand that when you are an entrepreneur, you are more willing to see the world as it is rather than blinding yourself somehow because of restrictions or regulations which you've been haunted by through many years. So I think in general, that is a good step. But I have to tell you, a lot of companies I deal with also realize that head-to-head, human-to-human is very natural when it comes to the digital age. Think about this. Amazon invented the one-click concept where you click once and then you get the products. It was a very simple type of navigation that was later on used by business executives. And guess what? Amazon became a bigger B2B company than B2C company. Now, the B2C people actually enjoyed working with Amazon because it was so simple to work with, intuitive, good customer service. So me as a private person actually had a very satisfying experience. And that's probably the reason why I, in a work capacity, would say, hey, let's bring in Amazon. They have a new, fresh perspective. And guess what? Suddenly the B2B and B2C disappeared. It became H2H. So what I've noticed is that a lot of startups, in particular technology-based companies, do not care about B2B or B2C anymore. They are very much H2H. But of course, if you go into the more conventional industries like fashion and retail and fast mover consumer goods, They are more stuck in an old mindset. Yet I have to say, in general, they're more open to the hate state theory than the big conglomerates with 300,000 staff. They tend to see the world from a very conservative, inside-out point of view.
We have another interesting question. What do you think is the most nonsense thing related to the pandemic times that we are going through that you've noticed so far?
I think there's a range of different rules which are coming out now, which is really crazy. I mean, in the UK, there was a rule recently that people, if they're going out for dinner at a restaurant, they were only allowed to be in a group of 4 if they were in a family. And by the way, all of them had to be in a family. However, if you could prove that you are working for a company and everyone could give a business card, you could be up to 30 people. I'm not sure people working in a corporate environment are infecting other people less and family members more. But that type of rule is some of the examples I've seen around the world. And you have to remember that there's actually a term around it called safety clutter. It's an Australian term which is based on a large research study showing that we have a tendency to grab on to safety excuses because it makes us feel good, it gives me a sense of power, and people kind of are paralyzed when there's a rule which is about safety, right? Now, what the same study shows is that 65% of all the safety-related rules we have in our environment actually are nonsense. They don't make sense at all. We just do it because it's kind of right. That's what I have to do. That's what I have to say. So you will notice that COVID-19, of course, is a major part of safety clutter issues where quite often, honestly, it doesn't make sense at all.
Well, remaining in the same area, we have a question about politics because we know we cannot have an evening without politics. And Robert is asking us, politics is inducing nonsense to the business environment and to society in general in Romania. What can we do to make our politicians use more common sense?
I think, honestly, that the politicians needs to see their own organization as a real company rather than some political monster. And then I don't need to tell you, I wrote an update an article in the New York Times recently about it. I would suggest that the governments are installing a ministry of common sense. And that should, one by one, remove the stupidities at a street level. There's a lot of stupid things going on in every country. Romania is certainly not an exception. And what I would say is that if they had the courage to start up a ministry of common sense and actually did things in a smart way, then I think the government would get more credibility. Now, I could just go to another country, which is called the Republic of Georgia, which I'm sure you're familiar with. In the Republic of Georgia, they actually started up a facility house in every single city across Georgia. That's a place, a one-stop place you go to, whether you want to be married or divorced, you want to start up a new company, buy a new car, have a license, whatever you want to do, and you will do that in 30 minutes. And I've been across the Republic of Georgia and I've seen those buildings. I've seen how quickly they turn things around. And that was born out of lack of common sense, where they build up this to bring back common sense in Georgia. So it actually is possible. But of course, it requires that the politicians have guts. If I was a politician, I tell you that's the first thing I'll do, because it will give you a credibility. And I think the voters will say, gosh, these guys are serious. They actually make things happen. And if there's one thing politicians are suffering from, well, then it's the very fact that nothing happens quite often.
Thank you very much, Martin. That is quite a hope you are giving us tonight. So hooray for the Ministry of Common Sense in every country from now on. We don't have too much time, unfortunately, to take more questions from our audience, but I do have a question for you at the end, because, you know, I'm here in this wonderful bookstore surrounded by books, talking to you through a screen, which is a little bit of nonsense, but I'm curious, how do you see the future of bookstores? And if can books and bookstores be of any help in cultivating common sense and empathy?
Bookstores have a thriving future. you will see that people will rush back to the bookstores once COVID-19 is starting to fade out, unless we will have a COVID-21 coming out. And you'll notice that people want to do it because they want to hang out. They want to feel the tactile sensation. We're thriving. We thrive on the tactile sensation. We thrive on sense of belonging. And all that is what a bookstore is offering. We actually saw that before the pandemic, that bookstores were thriving. In fact, sales were going up 6 to 7% in the US, and digital books were going down. And I'm pretty convinced we'll see that happening again once we are over this pandemic, of course.
Thank you very much, Martin. I hope we will see each other very soon in a bookstore or on a stage or whatever there is, but not through a screen, hopefully. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We are looking forward for you to come to Romania and visit us. And to all our readers watching, don't forget that you can find Martin's book now online on Cărturești.ro and in all Cărturești bookstores. And also I'm glad to announce that the Romanian edition of the book, Ministerul Bunului Simț, will be launched in May by Publica Publishing and will be available also in Cărturești. Thank you very much, Martin. It was a pleasure to talk to you again. Hope to see you soon. Meanwhile, stay safe and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, Martin. Bye-bye. Have a nice evening.